Hello, welcome to Thomas Balch Library. We're very happy and excited to have Amy here to discuss her research into the life of Loudoun resident Hannah Nokes. And before I give an official introduction, I just wanted to go through some housekeeping. So here at the library, we have bathrooms straight back behind the meeting room. And then also we have a water fountain to the left if you need it. As you'll see that we do have recording equipment here. This event is being recorded and will be put on to the Thomas Balch Library YouTube channel. So the camera is firmly pointed this way. But I just would mention that we are being recorded. So your voice, if you ask any questions, will be recorded. As for questions, Amy has indicated that she's happy to have questions while she's presenting. Just ask that you raise your hand so she can call on you for those questions. So without further ado, let me introduce Amy. Amy Bertsch is a historian specializing in African American and Northern Virginia history. She taught the public history and the historic preservation certificate program at Northern Virginia Community College. And she previously worked in the public history for the Office of Historic Alexandria. Amy has an MA in history from Sam Houston State University, where she served as associate editor for the EastTexasHistory.org under the direction of Dr. Jeffrey L. Littlejohn, who is the co-editor of Queer Virginia, where this research is published, along with Dr. Charles H. Ford. So I hope you help me join in welcoming Amy.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you everyone for being here. Can anyone not hear me? Okay. Like Anna said, you have a question, raise your hand or wave or throw something at me. I will try to remain engaged. And I just wanted to thank Anna and the entire team here, because when I was doing this research, I did spend some time here. And when I was hoping to find something a little more, they went all out to run down any possible leads. And I'm very grateful for the help I received there, as well as over at the courthouse. So it's a real treat for me to be able to come back and as much research as I've done at this library over the years, this is I think my first time actually sharing the results of the research. So, and my talk today is a look into the life of one of our gender variant or gender non-conforming neighbors, a person who today would likely be identified as transgender. The term transgender is relatively new. However, people have been gender non-conforming throughout time, and gender non-conforming folks are part of many cultures throughout time and throughout our world. They've always existed. And some examples of this would be in the Native American cultures, the Two-Spirit, and then in Southeast Asia, Hijras. So those are just a couple examples, but my focus is very much on one of our local community members, Hannah Nokes, and I'm happy to introduce you to her today. She identified as a gender that was different than what was assigned to her at birth. And I want to just explain some terminology, and I'm trying to be respectful to her. In using names, the name she was assigned at birth is different than what we call her today. Today, she's known as Hannah Nokes, but her identity and her name change over time. So when I do use the name she was given at birth, which was Hammond, I'm not being disrespectful. I don't want to, for anyone who's not aware, people who are transgender and perhaps change their name often consider the name they were given at birth to be their dead name. And using it is very insulting. And I mean no disrespect to Hannah Nokes when I refer to the name she was given at birth. And when I do, I'm doing it because I'm citing a specific source or giving a direct quote. So I just wanted to share that. And she was very well known in her community. And I wanted to offer some evidence too that she was in many ways accepted by her community. Her story today is known beyond the place where she grew up and the place where she worked, because she happened to be a witness in a very high profile murder case. And that case and trial, it's almost 100 years ago. And I will definitely be sharing details of the case shortly. And I also want to share some of the resources and places that I did to conduct this research into Hannah's life and identity. So go ahead and get started.
I need to click on the presentation.
Okay. So I have this helpful map, but I'm hoping folks here may be familiar with this area. Anyway, so Hannah was born in 1898 in the Loudoun community of Dranesville, which was near Sterling. And as I said, she was first known as Hammond Johnson. Hannah originally had the last name of her mother, Jenny Johnson. Hannah's father was Albert Nokes, and he was a member of the well-known Nokes family who farmed in the Sterling area for several generations. Albert Nokes was married to somebody else and had several children with his wife when Hannah was born outside of his marriage. So at the time she was born, she was going by her mother's last name of Johnson. But Hannah later used her father's last name of Nokes, and she was close to her half siblings on the Nokes side of her family. So her identity was known. Her that she was a Nokes was definitely known in the community. And I just wanted to kind of there's actually a community that's identified on the map that says Nokes, and it was Nokes Mountain. And it was for the Nokes family. And there's Sterling. And then here's the border with Fairfax County. And so this area, you see here, it says 28. That's not Route 28 today. This road becomes 228. It's Dranesville Road. And it's the one that goes past Herndon High School and comes out at Route 7. Okay. So this is not Sully Road. This is Dranesville Road. So for anyone who's not familiar with the Nokes family, they, again, farmers, well known in the community, especially among African Americans, very prominent, with other farming families in the area like the Eves. And they ended up owning quite a bit of land. They donated land that was used to establish the Nokes Colored School, which was a school for kids in the community to go to during segregation, during Jim Crow. And this road that runs in Sterling today, Nokes Boulevard, is named for the family. So Hannah Nokes, by age 20, was working just across the Loudoun line in Fairfax County in the Dranesville community. And this is her World War I draft registration card. And it has the name that she was given at birth. And it identifies her employer, also where she was living, and her nearest relative, which is her mother, Jenny Johnson. So I wanted to just point out a couple things because I think it's important that this is one of the things that's captured on this draft registration card was what kind of work a person was doing. I should give a little bit of background. If you don't know it was a requirement that males between certain ages registered during World War I. And so not everybody who was filled out a draft card actually served. For people who were Black, the corner was cut out of their registration card. So just a couple things to be aware of. In this case, This is Hannah's card. It was completed in Leesburg in Loudoun County, although she was working in on the Fairfax side. She's working for the McMillan family, which owned a couple of different properties along Dranesville Road. They were dairy farmers. And her occupation is listed as housework. Well, for men filling out their World War I draft registration card in this community, a lot of people were laborers, some were farm workers. Somebody identified as doing housework would be very unusual for records that are exclusively for men. And the other thing I think is worth noting is her signature, because she couldn't read or write, and when she signs her documents, it's with a mark. She does not write her name. It's simply an X or a check mark. And the registrar noted that, and it says his mark. So Hannah's working for the McMillan family, and she continues to work for them into early adulthood and really throughout her life. In addition to working for the McMillans, she also earned a living by taking in laundry. She would launder and iron clothes for people in her home and then deliver them to the family. Excuse me. I think I'm fighting what everybody else is fighting, so I have cough drops if I start to get scratchy voice. So in addition to that, she also kind of made her way by taking in boarders. She opened her home to people who were lodgers or part of her household for a fee. And then she also allowed travelers who were passing through to spend the night at her home. During Jim Crow segregation, overnight accommodations were very hard for people who were African American to find, particularly in the rural South. And so she would take in people she didn't know to spend the night because they needed a place to stay. And it was a way for her to, earn a little bit of money. And that was the case in January of 1932, when two men were walking down the Leesburg Pike, or Route 7, and they needed a place to stay. One of the men was named George Crawford, and he and his companion asked a white teenager who was on horseback if he knew of a place where they could stay. And that teen, his name was Robert Hughes, he lived on his family's farm in Sterling. So he would have been very familiar with the area. So the Hughes boy directs George Crawford and his companion to Hannah Nokes' home. Crawford and the other man did spend the night at Hannah's home, and then they left the following morning. Well, a couple days later, two white women, a wealthy widow named Agnes Ilsley and her maid, were found bludgeoned to death in Middleburg. An investigation quickly identified Hannah's overnight house guest, George Crawford, as a suspect. Crawford was later arrested in Massachusetts, but there was great concern by members of the community and leaders in the Black civil rights movement, the NAACP, that he might be lynched if he were returned. If he were extradited to Virginia, if he was returned to Loudoun County, he could very likely be lynched. But even with reassurances for his safety, people here in Leesburg said there's no way any harm will come to him. We will keep him safe. We are not like that here. We will protect him. But even with reassurances for his safety, there was also a question of whether he could even receive a fair trial. Both the grand jury and any jury that would have been assembled in Loudoun County at that time would have been made up entirely of white men. And it would be almost 2 years after the crime occurred before the case actually goes to trial. By that time, because of all these factors, there's a lot of media interest. There's a lot of attention on this case. Well, another thing that makes it interesting is the defense team. The NAACP is so concerned for George Crawford's right to a fair trial and his safety, they assemble a defense team that's headed up by Charles Hamilton Houston. He is the legal mastermind who would oversee the dismantling of Jim Crow. The Crawford case was really a critical one in the pursuit of civil rights because Houston used it to challenge Virginia's all-white juries and lily white juror rolls throughout the South. In the end, Crawford's trial is entirely, his jury is entirely composed of white men. But very quickly, Loudoun and other jurisdictions around Virginia begin adding African Americans to their juror rolls, and some are even called for jury duty. I know within a year, there was one in Alexandria who was a Black man who was called to serve in Alexandria. But what this meant for our story and Hannah's story is that because of the nature of the crimes, the concern for the safety of the defendant, and Charles Houston's challenges of the jury system, there is a lot of interest in this case. And we get coverage, obviously, by the local papers, but also the DC papers, the big DC papers, national wires, and the Black press. Charles Houston assembled an all-Black defense team for a capital murder case. This would have been entirely unheard of. And that's his defense team right there. This is Charles Houston, that's James Guy Tyson, that's Walter White, he's the executive director of the NAACP. And this photo was taken at the courthouse outside. Those are, one of them is Leon Ransom, and the other is, I can't remember the other one's name.
Yeah, he's one of the other law professors.
Yeah, I can find out.
Yeah.
So this had never happened before. So there's media interest in every aspect of this case. And when the trial finally gets underway in December of 1933, the courthouse is packed. There's hundreds of people waiting outside. For Crawford's safety, he's not even kept in jail here. He's being housed at the jail in Alexandria. So every morning, state troopers have to transport him from Alexandria all the way out here, which of course adds to the spectacle at the courthouse. And then at the end of the day, he goes back to the jail in Alexandria. So there's a lot of media coverage, a lot of photos, and the trial does get underway. What's significant is that to help tie Crawford to the area and to the crime, the Commonwealth, the prosecution, calls Hannah Nokes to the witness stand. She appears on the witness stand, and she was wearing a dress, a beaded necklace, a velvet hat, and a wig. And some news organizations reported on her physical appearance. They described her as a boy girl, a man masquerading as a woman, a lady man, and a fairy. Those were some of the terms they used. One of the papers in particular, actually, now that I'm looking at this, I'm trying to see. I'm sorry, you had asked who the other person in the photo was previously. It's hard to see here, but this is, that's Leon Ransom. And then this individual's last name was Lovett. Do you know, professor at Howard? Thank you. So the Afro-American in particular was heavily focused on Hannah Nokes's appearance and presence on the witness stand. And in doing this, they focused heavily on her gender identity. right, when you're looking at a witness, there's all types of things you have to consider, you know, their truthfulness, are they candid? Are they forthcoming? Are they cooperative? Her appearance. Several outlets focused heavily on that. So the Afro was the largest Black newspaper in the country at that time, and its coverage of the trial is really important. When they cover the case, they talk about her, but they don't refer to her as Hannah, they call her Annie. I've never found any other references to anybody else calling her Annie, either Hammond or Hannah, but not Annie. But they do, their reporting is significant. And there's some problems with it. I believe some of the coverage includes, some things are just errors, like up here where it says queer witness testifies for Crawford. Hannah was not testifying for the defense. She was testifying for the prosecution. Or the Commonwealth is what there's a term, you know, referring to the state. So the headline's wrong. And that's, you know, that happens. People misinterpret information. But some of the errors are actually seem to be outright fabrications. For example, they reported that Charles Houston asked Hannah if she was Miss, Mrs., or Mr. Nokes. But this line of questioning does not appear in the trial transcript. And the transcript actually shows that Houston never even questioned Hannah on the stand. She was called as a witness for the prosecution. They never cross-examined her. No other paper reported either that that Houston had questioned her. So that's kind of, and you see it right here, speculating whether she was Miss, Mrs., or Mr. Another account that was kind of questionable is that in one of the articles they wrote, court authorities compel her to use the male restroom in spite of feminine attire. Well, you know, you think about that and you go, well, I guess I could understand that. We know the bathroom issues that exist today. But I thought that's really puzzling because during that time, the bathrooms would have been segregated already. And then I was like, wait, this is the old courthouse. And so I talked to some people who know the courthouse, know the history of the courthouse. I moved as recently as a year ago in one of the architectural studies. And at that time, there were no restrooms for the public in the courthouse. They had outhouses or privies or whatever on the western edge or on the eastern edge of the courthouse square, I guess. So I just think it was, you know, an odd thing to include, but also it's kind of interesting when you consider that the Afro's readers in the South were already subjected to using separate bathrooms because of Jim Crow. So the fact that the Afro is using this as a, you know, in their story, I thought was, I really question what the motivation would have been. Okay, so here, what we're looking at is part of the evidence. I want to just point this out. It's from it's a note that I'm going to be talking about in a minute. It's hard to see, but underneath it says it is from the Loudoun County Circuit Court Archives. So on the stand, Hannah Nokes did testify that Crawford spent the night in her home. But it's her nephew's testimony that is perhaps more significant. When Crawford left the next morning, he indicated that he would pay for his stay and that he would send money back. And according to the nephew, Crawford wrote down the address in a little notebook. And then he left. So Crawford leaves after writing down an address in the notebook. After the murders, the victim's car is recovered in Alexandria. And one of the things the police find in searching the car is this little note. And it's going to be hard to see, but it says, Mr. We think it's Nock. There's a box number, then that turned in Virginia. So it would have indicated that that was Hannah's mailing address. So I mentioned Charles Houston didn't question Hannah on the stand, but he did question her nephew. And he asked the young man, is Hannah Nokes your aunt or your uncle? And the nephew stated aunt. Houston replied, your aunt? And the young man said yes. Under oath, the nephew identified Hannah as his aunt while he's being questioned by the most prominent African-American attorney in the country. So despite the fact that Houston questions Hannah's gender identity and that several newspapers noted her appearance, the Commonwealth apparently had no issue putting her on the stand as a witness, and her own nephew testified that he considered her to be a female relative. All right, so I want to go into a little bit more about the Afro-American and its coverage and some of the issues, because this talk is beyond the Red-Wigged boy girl, and it's actually their headline that comes from. So the Afro reporter who was credited with most of these stories was a writer named Ralph Matthews. He wrote extensively about female impersonators, drag shows, and this was during a time of something called the pansy craze. It was very popular in New York and in DC at that time to have female impersonators or drag entertainers. And it wasn't necessarily new and they didn't entirely go away, but it was definitely at a peak during this time. So Ralph Matthews writes extensively about the pansy craze and is looking into gender nonconformity when he decides to explore Hannah's life and testimony. And his coverage of the Crawford case, he offers this kind of quasi-psychological opinion to explain Hannah's queer desire to wear clothes of the opposite sex, and that it need not be a sexual abnormality, but may be explained as fetishism, which takes many varying forms. Matthews also acknowledges that along with, quote, his feminine attire, Hammond has also adopted all the mannerisms of women, ultimately indicating that this was not simply a case of cross-dressing. Matthews also reported, again, with much speculation and questionable factual assertions about Hannah's childhood and accounts of her domestic work in a private home, as well as her supposed military experience, right? So although we know that Hannah did fill out a draft registration card, there's absolutely no record of her serving. I checked the courthouse, I've checked National Archives, I've checked ship manifests to see troops going overseas. And as it indicates in my introduction, my specialization in history is actually African-American history. And I've studied the troops who served during World War I extensively. So I searched with Nokes, I searched with Johnson, I tried very hard to see, and I could never find any documentation that Hannah had any military service. However, Ralph Matthews described that Hannah was living as a woman, quote, until the long arm of Uncle Sam reached down into remote little Herndon, Virginia, and called for Hammond Nokes. According to Matthews, the birth certificate for Annie Nokes and Hammond Nokes were one and the same. So Annie went to war. Matthews explained that her record, quote, could not be ascertained, but he did imply that Hannah served in the war and even saw combat. So he doesn't really provide a source for her supposed military service. And again, there's some problems with this account because like other Virginians born in 1898, Hannah Nokes would not have had a birth certificate issued when she was born. Later on, once the state began issuing birth certificates, people could go back and get a delayed one, but she never did. There's no birth certificate for any of Johnson or Nokes for her that we could locate. So that again cast doubt on Matthew's description of the supposed birth certificates for Annie and Hammond being one and the same. So after all his questionable accounts, Matthews ends up concluding, quote, "There is no evidence throughout the county to reflect on Hammond's reputation for morality and propriety. He has, so far as is known, been a perfect lady, living above reproach, an industrious and an energetic laundress and cook." So with this assessment, Matthews admits that during the Crawford trial, Hannah's character had not been called into question, regardless of her gender nonconformity. So despite publishing some fabrications, and at times they do mock Hannah's appearance, the Black press is largely responsible for her story being known today, because the coverage by the traditional wires and even the big papers really did not mention her gender identity at all. A handful did, but as far as a national presence, it was really the Black newspapers that picked up on this. So beyond the press coverage, who else who was involved with the George Crawford case, and how did they perceive Hannah, right? There was a civil rights activist named Martha Grunig, and she was a very high profile advocate for Crawford, and she was very critical of Hannah. She was a former assistant secretary for the NAACP, and she ends up calling Hannah, quote, "a rather disreputable colored man who has been passing as a woman." And she implied that this passing contributed to a perceived lack of credibility, or at least a negative reputation in the community. Was also really critical of Charles Houston, and she questioned why he failed to challenge the credibility of other witnesses. For example, challenging the credibility of Hannah's nephew on the stand, as well as a man from Herndon, Joe Hill, who had also been staying at Hannah's home. So she's critical of a lot, but in addressing Hannah's faults, she picks up on her gender identity. Another interesting person involved with this case, we saw his photo earlier, was Walter White. And as I mentioned, he was the executive director of the NAACP, and he goes to this trial and he's there, you know, it's like gavel to gavel. He's taking notes the whole time, which was like so cool to actually get to read, you know, his notes, those little jottings throughout the trial. And that's what this is. The NAACP papers are at the Library of Congress, and they are vast and amazing and, you know, infuriating when you read some of the things they had to take on, but just an amazing collection. So this is from he's jotting during Hannah's testimony, and he really doesn't say anything about her gender identity exactly, but he describes her clothing, including the rabbit fur collar, a handkerchief tucked in her cuff, and he wrote that laughter followed when Hannah stood up, put her hands on her hips, and stated, "That favors the man very well," apparently referring to the defendant. And White added in his notes, high-pitched voice. And then he moves on to the next witness, who is Hannah's nephew. Another person that we can look at is the prosecutor, Commonwealth's attorney, John Gallagher. And he calls Hannah as a witness for the prosecution. So presumably he didn't believe that her gender identity would impugn her credibility. Which I wonder today, like, how would that go over? He had earlier called her before the grand jury, but he might not have actually needed her to even testify in a public courtroom, right? The grand jury is going to not be a public proceeding. But to have her called as a witness in a courtroom, he knew how she would be dressed and the potential of how people would perceive her. And he probably didn't even need to call her, because when the note was found in Agnes Ilsley's car in the days after the murders, and it referred to the Nokes home, Gallagher could have just established that connection, that Crawford had been at the house and written the note down by using Hannah's nephew's testimony, right? He probably didn't even need Hannah. He could have just said that the nephew saw Crawford writing this note down. But he still chose to call her as a witness, which to me indicates that he found her to be credible. And so while he may have had questions about Hannah's gender identity, he didn't make them public. Houston and James Guy Tyson, who was one of the members of the defense team, they considered Hannah's gender identity very much so when challenging her credibility. So we really don't know what Charles Houston's personal view of gender nonconforming people are. But both Howard University, where he was the law school dean, and the NAACP leadership, which he joined as special counsel, definitely would have considered gender nonconforming people to be damaging to the respectability that both organizations sought for the Black community. And historian Kim Gallen published a really insightful book about Black media coverage of really kind of sex and sensational news in the Black press that was very helpful. And she wrote that in early 1934, which was just weeks after the Crawford trial ends, Howard University was engaged in, quote, a public fight to distance itself and respectable Black Washingtonians from aspersions about gender nonconforming expression. A stand that included its president actually contacting the police in DC to shut down a female impersonator's ball that was scheduled to take place at a nearby Masonic hall. So Howard University doesn't want to have the pansy craze impacting them. Well, 5 years later, the NAACP refuses to take the case of a gender nonconforming person, a person named Polly Murray, who was a very important civil rights activist. At this time, wasn't well known, and has only in recent years really been recognized for the work that she did. She did use female pronouns. So the NAACP would not take Polly Murray's case. She had been refused admission to graduate school at the University of North Carolina. Roy Wilkins was the assistant secretary at the NAACP, and he believed that Murray presented a significant risk to their organization, to the NAACP, and to Houston. Houston, according to Wilkins, agreed most emphatically that the association should not be connected in any way with Miss Murray's application. So they refused to take her case. And historian Glenda Elizabeth Gilmore acknowledges that it's Murray's earlier, acknowledges like that, yeah, there were other issues with Polly Murray. She had some communist leanings, and overall the NAACP really was not into taking on female plaintiffs. But Gilmore explains that the NAACP could not represent her because she did not conform to female standards. Murray used male nicknames, frequently dressed as a man, had intimate relationships with women, and experienced a sexual identity crisis. And Murray concludes that before the adjective existed, Murray thought that she was a transgendered person. So these events provide some context for both how Howard and the NAACP, two institutions most strongly associated with Charles Houston, how they sought to avoid any perception or acceptance or tolerance of gender nonconformity. In studying Hannah's life, I also looked at the records that Charles Houston's team assembled. At Howard University's Moreland Spingarn Research Center, I was able to review the papers of one of his co-counsels, James Guy Tyson. And that's what you see here. Houston and Tyson actually go to Hannah's home along Dranesville Road to interview her in advance of the trial. And in their account, they describe Nokes as this Hammond person. And they found her to be less than forthcoming. They did note that she hosted weary travelers, as many as 6 a week. And they added that these overnight guests in her home were strangers at that. And I just think, like, wait, this is Charles Houston, and he's disturbed by the fact that Hannah's letting strangers spend the night in her home, as many as 6 a week, when he and his defense team couldn't even get overnight. Yeah, they couldn't even stay in Leesburg during the trial. They had to commute back and forth to DC every night because, yeah, right? They couldn't find, I mean, it was not unusual for people who were Black to have challenges finding appropriate accommodations. And the fact that they think, they actually say strangers at that. They also write that they considered Nokes's home to be a den for all the thieves, sissies, cutthroats, and other depraved and degraded folk of that surrounding country. And I'm like thinking, this is really interesting because it was their client who spent the night there. So are they describing her usual house guests or their client? Yes.
Is it okay if I take a picture?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. My name was
Yeah, please do.
So if Houston is thinking this about her, why did he ever call her to, or he did?
She was a witness for the Commonwealth.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the prosecutor didn't see it that way, but he did.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. And it is interesting because he doesn't cross-examine her.
Yes.
And you know what? It's his job to discredit the Commonwealth's witnesses. Like, absolutely. That's what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to defend his client, come up with reasons, to impugn their witnesses. But I was like, wow, that's pretty harsh. And all I can picture, for the record, I went to Herndon High, so back in the 80s, and it was still very country along Dranesville Road then. And I look back in my mind and I'm thinking, wait, what was going on here? Like on Dranesville Road and Hannah's home. And I'm reading this and I'm like, yeah, I'm not really, I don't know what to think there. But yeah, Houston and Tyson, not fans of Hannah Nokes. So in the end, Houston recognizes that his client is actually guilty. And although he was able to, challenge the racial composition of the jury, in the end, it was an all-white jury. The jury found Crawford guilty, but spared his life. So that would have been a victory for the NAACP and for Houston. And most of the news coverage really did focus on the merits of the case, the verdict, the sentence. And Hannah Nokes' appearance as a witness was really a very small part, if it was mentioned at all. But scholars have studied this case extensively, and books have been published about it, or it's been referenced in many books. And somehow Hannah's story really had not been captured by people studying, people who do transgender history. And again, that's not my specialization, although I'm doing it more and more. But I just felt like how many people read about her and just kept on. And there was a book published about the case, and it mentions Hannah's appearance. Was it David Bradley? I can't remember his name, but I'm sure it's here. And I just was like, wait, I know what happens with Crawford. I want to find out more about this witness. So I kept looking, and 3 years after the trial, Hannah Nokes was in the news again, but very different circumstances. She was featured in a government magazine promoting rural electrification. Part of the New Deal's response to the Great Depression was to bring electricity to rural America. The federal government established the Rural Electrification Administration, known as the REA, and they would try to encourage residents to electrify their homes and farms. And this is an interesting connection and a little bit of local history. I'm one of those like short attention span, right? I'm like, oh, I want to look at this. I want to look at this. And all of a sudden I'm like all about the REA electrified farm, because this was so crazy. The REA arranges to bring electricity to a farm in Sterling. And the idea would be that it would get wired and powered with electricity, and it would be a demonstration farm. So the REA could bring people from other parts of the country, all around the world, out here to show what was going on in Sterling at this farm, thanks to electricity. So the farm that was chosen was owned by the Hughes family, and it was located right along Route 7. And remember I mentioned that when Crawford's going down Route 7 and the kid on horseback directs him to Hannah's home, that boy's name was Robert Hughes. So this is where he lived. This was his parents' farm, Jesse and Lula Hughes, and the farm was known as Rosedale. In the summer of 1936, it's featured in several newspaper articles as well as in an REA publication. So interesting local history and a connection to our story. So, and I think it becomes Sterling Park, just in case you want to, pay your respects. So the REA publishes a monthly magazine called Rural Electrification News, and it highlights the benefits and progress of electrifying homes and farms. That same summer, 1936, Rural Electrification News features Hannah Nokes as the working class success story who is benefiting from electricity. This publication had been digitized, and I found this amazing article online through Google, but it wasn't just searching her name. I was searching variations of her name. Her name was spelled Nokes. This had it spelled as Noakes. And I only found it because I was searching different spellings. And that's something, if anyone's doing research, genealogy, history work, use variations of the name, consider typos, spelling mistakes. But that's how I ended up finding this article and this photo. So I wanted to just share that tip. And so in 1936, that summer when this article comes out, there were already several farms along Dranesville Road that had been electrified. And according to this article, one of Hannah's employers, Mrs. McMillan, same family that Hannah had been working for almost 20 years earlier, that Mrs. McMillan signed a loan for Hannah so that her home could be wired with electricity. Hannah also purchased an electric washing machine and ironing, what was called on easy terms, like a favorable loan. And so with electricity and these modern appliances, her business of taking in laundry would definitely be more efficient and more profitable. The article in part stated, Hammond is known throughout the countryside for her industry, honesty, and good nature. Each morning she rises with the sun to wash and iron the clothes of her employers who live in and about Herndon. Never having been known to disappoint a customer, she has built up a laundry clientele of a scope that only a sight of the stacks of clothes can convey. Born in the community where she lives, as were generations of her ancestors, she is regarded with affection and respect by her neighbors. In this article, which you see features a photo of Nokes. She's wearing an apron, a mop cap, and washing laundry by hand in a tub. The article stated that, quote, she sings and laughs about her work even more now, that she would soon be getting electricity. And there's really nothing in the article. I mean, they identify her as Hammond because that was her legal name. And they mention that she is strong. But there's really nothing that casts any doubt as to her gender. They make some class and racial distinctions, but the Rural Electrification News clearly presents Hannah Nokes as a woman and did nothing that would cause their readers to question her gender identity. And during this time and in the years really before and after, millions of African Americans are moving from the rural South to the North, to the Midwest, urban areas, and even as far west as, to the Bay Area of California, in what is known as the Great Migration. Some people didn't move hundreds of miles. Some just moved to a close by urban area. For example, Washington, D.C. or Baltimore, so they would move from a rural area, not a great distance, but still to a more urban environment. And for many people who were gender nonconforming, moving to a city allowed them to live as their true self. Historian Susan Stryker wrote that when the urban population surpassed the rural population in the 1920s, it gave people who were assigned as male at birth, people who were designated male when they were born, but identified as female. She wrote that they now had greater opportunities to live as women in cities far from their communities where they had grown up, right? So here's a perfect opportunity for somebody like Hannah to just go to DC and live as her true self. But she didn't. She continues to stay in the same community, Sterling, Dranesville. I mean, her entire life, she doesn't leave, which reinforces my belief that she did find some acceptance in her community. She had regular work. She had both her laundry business and working for the McMillan families. And there's, her employer who's willing to sign, co-sign for a loan to help her. Okay, so I want to share some confirmation really of this that we find in census records. Census records frequently have standard information like gender, race, age, birthplace, and occupation. Has anyone worked with census records before? Doing history research or genealogy? Okay. So I'm going to go through a few of these. In the first one, which is the 1920 census, she is identified as male and has the name of Hammond Jones, right? Hammond Jones. So not even Johnson Jones, rather than Johnson, but we see also that she's living next door to the McMillans. That's Zenas McMillan, who was listed on the World War I draft registration card as her employer just 2 years before this record was produced. So that reinforces that this is indeed Hannah. She's listed as a laborer on a farm. So in 1930, you see here, she is listed as Hannah Nokes. Again, right next to the McMillans. And it notes that her occupation is wash and iron, which is what we know since she was had a laundry business. And it also records how many hours a week. Actually, does this one have might not have how many hours a week she works. She works a lot. All right, so now we're going to move forward 10 more years. And in 1940, she's there. She has a boarder in her home. She's listed as a laundress. And this is indicating that she's working 84 hours a week for her business. But again, Hannah Nokes, but female.
It's in 1930, so it lists her as a female as well.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, so she's female. So we see male, female, female again. And also in 1950. So 1950 census is the most recent one that is fully publicly available. They are kept confidential. They extract data from them, but the individual entries are not public until 72 years after the census is taken. So this is the most recent one that's available. And she's got several boarders in her home. And she's doing laundry. She's only working 60 hours a week, so things are getting better, right? But all these records do show, you know, even though the name might be a little off or change, or the gender changes, everything else, like what we know, shows that this is indeed the same person. And we also know from other records that she's still working for the McMillan family. In the 1960s, Hannah Nokes signs up to get a Social Security account, which Social Security number and account. And it's her employer, Selma McMillan Mott, whose signature you see down there. And this is another person, Margaret McMillan Jones, they're witnesses. Or my off a generation. Anyways, Selma McMillan Mott is the one who fills this form out for Hannah. Remember, Hannah can't read and write. Hannah's illiterate. And Selma is the one who filled out this paperwork for her. And it shows that Hannah is working for Selma McMillan Mott at the Willow Springs Dairy Farm. And this is a farm that was right next to Herndon High School. It just got demolished a couple of years ago. And she signs her name with an X. I mean, it's crossed out. And then here, this is her employer filling out the form. So there's an option for male or female, and it's checked female, which indicates that her employer, Mrs. Mott, considers her to be female. And if Hannah's illiterate, then Hannah's not going to know which box Mrs. Mott even checked, right? So I just thought that was pretty compelling. Also, here's the, Hannah Nokes. Place of birth, Dranesville, mother's name. Father's name is Albert Nokes, all the things that we already know. So we, again, reinforcing that this is the same person and a member of the Nokes family. I was looking also into some context for Hannah working as a domestic in a home or doing laundry or working as a cook. How many other Black transgender women, did this also, right? And so I started doing different kinds of searches and try to see, was this a common thing? Was this unusual? And, it's a hard thing to figure out because most people would probably just go undetected, or how would you even know? And so I did some different types of newspaper searches, and I found several articles. This is just a snapshot of some of those. And these are folks who likely were assigned male at birth, identified as female, and they're only outed. It's only determined that they were assigned male at birth when something happens to out them. Sometimes it's an arrest. Sometimes it's when they die. And this was very interesting, to read some of these articles, and I'm doing more research because I do think it's interesting. I really, again, this is transgender history is not my specialization. And so I reached out to some people who do specialize in this to get a better sense. And Dr. Nikita Shepard, who just finished their PhD at Columbia this year and is now a professor at Elon, told me that pretty much all historians who've commented on this agree that the exposures, that somebody being outed, whose names we know from press coverage, must only be the tip of the iceberg, and that such gender crossing in both directions must have been far more common than anyone knew at the time, or that we will ever be able to confirm. And in reading about these individuals who were detected and exposed, again, usually it happens when they're arrested or when they die. I was focused on African American, but potentially, I guess, white Americans could also be having this experience if they, do this type of work. So I think there's potential for a deeper dive into this. And I'll be retiring in May, so maybe this will be something that I get to do full time, right? Or more of. I want to talk a little bit about the Nokes family because Hannah was close to them, and she often cared for the children of her nieces and nephews. And I was fortunate to talk with several members of the family, and this is some of the family members that you can see here. This was at the Tippett Hill Cemetery rededication in 2019. Is anyone familiar with the Nokes family here? Okay. So I'm going to try to explain how Hannah is related, and I should have done a tree. So I apologize. Hannah's father's other children included Clarence Nokes and Carl Albert Nokes. Clarence was the father of Carrie Nokes. Carrie Nokes was very well known in this community. She provided oral histories that are on file here, an amazing source of information, active in her community, and she lived a very long life. So Carrie would have been Hannah's niece. Carrie also had a sister, Arnetha Nokes Jackson, who was still living when I began this research. But unfortunately, because of COVID, I was never able to speak with her, and she passed in 2020, in that fall of 2020. So Carrie and Arnetha were Hannah's nieces. I was able to meet, as I said, several family members there. And I've also been in touch with Calvin Nokes, who is the son of Carl Albert Nokes Jr. And Carl Albert Nokes was Jr. was Hannah's nephew. Senior was her brother. And so Calvin was Hannah's great nephew. And Calvin remembered Hannah very fondly. She was his babysitter when he was growing up in the 1960s. And he said he did not know what transsexual was, but he knew he loved the woman who cared for him. And he was, quote, blessed to have known her. Another great niece, told me that she fondly remembered visiting Hannah's home and that she made baked caramel cake. And that was a happy memory for several of the great nieces and nephews. When Hannah got older and had to be hospitalized, her great nephew, Calvin, again, he was very concerned for her. And he explained that he had no idea about trans or anything until later, when I heard things like being in a hospital and nurses discovering she was a man. And Selma McMillan Mott's grandson, he believed that Hannah was actually intersex, but preferred to be identified as female. And he also recalled Hannah being upset when she was hospitalized and had her wig removed. Hannah was a longtime member of her church, Salem Baptist Church, which was at where Georgetown Pike and Seneca Road meet up, right in that area. The building's not standing any longer, but she was active in her church. And according to one of her obituaries, she was involved in the missionary circle, the flower club, the kitchen club, and the dining club at her church. When she died in 1972, her funeral was held at that church. Green Funeral Home in Herndon handled her arrangements, and her death notice indicated that her casket was going to be closed at the church. Calvin told me that he had been concerned about how she was going to be dressed when she was buried. And he said that when he saw her at the funeral home, he was happy to see that she was in, quote, a beautiful blue dress. Her death certificate does identify her as male, but Hannah Nokes was buried among other members of the Nokes family at the family cemetery in Sterling, and her obituaries identified her as Miss Nokes. As I mentioned, in 2021, the last McMillan Farm house in Dranesville was demolished. In 2023, the historic courthouse in Leesburg was renamed for Charles Houston. And then a year ago this month, it was named a National Historic Landmark. In 2019, there was a report published here in Loudoun about the historical significance of the courthouse in Loudoun's African-American history. And it doesn't mention Hannah Nokes at all. But the National Historic Landmark nomination does include her, and I tried to highlight that there. And one of the things that I think was really interesting in what they wrote is that they do identify her as transgender, and they note that it is one of the earliest known instances of an openly transgender person testifying in Virginia courts, right? So, but not the earliest, one of the earliest. And that's because in the 1600s, there was a individual whose gender identity was repeatedly called into question. Their name was Thomas Hall or Thomasine Hall. And they actually had to testify in court regarding their own gender identity. And that case has been researched extensively. We don't know what happened to them, but that was in the 1600s. So today, as transgender people are being targeted and being politicized, Hannah's life and Thomasine Hall's life, remind us that we've always had neighbors who were transgender, and now would be a good time to, share their stories and elevate them, if only, not just for their legacy, but to help folks today who are not only not being accepted, but are being targeted because of their gender identity. So, thank you for letting me share Hannah's story with you. And I hope you're up for questions or discussion. Thank you. Yes.
I have a question. So, you already answered my question, but I just wanted to get your reaction to, finding Hannah Nokes' interview in the electric, like how excited were you when you found that article? Cause that seems like so out of left field
Oh my
that you
God.
found it, but
I'm like, wait, she's testifying in court and now she's the poster child for rural electricity. I'm like, is she like the Forrest Gump of Black transgender women and Jim Crow?
yeah.
So yeah, I was excited and at that point, I was still just doing basic research. The plans for Queer Virginia, the publication, I don't think came about until like 2019. And this research was, prior to that. So I didn't know that I would be able to use her photo in this way. So it was the photo, but it was also, this is a government publication. This isn't Ralph Matthews, caught up in, speculation and newspaper articles. This is the REA. And yeah, they're trying to push, electrification, but, everything checks out. I mean, the Macmillans are there. Hannah's work as a laundress is well known. So I found it to be a credible source as well. So I wasn't just excited that they included her. I was excited that it was like, hey, this is a good source. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, well, someone who does research like this, that's like a gold mine.
Yeah.
When you can find stuff like that. So that's why I was like, ooh, that's cool. Yeah.
That was New Deal days, and it was there was Virginia Electric Power, now Dominion, wouldn't go far off main highways to run the lines. And so the anti-birder people and Virginia Electric Power was just bird organization. And so they, under Roosevelt, they had all these campaigns to try to extend the electric power and everything. And they were run by people that were, New Dealers.
Yeah,
They
very
were not
progressive. Yeah.
people. Yeah. The man named Whitehead, his daughter gave an interview here, and it told me a lot about Andrew Whitehead Thomas. And that, there's something like that. The other thing is that the big question, of course, back in 1976, when I was moving to Leesburg, and I knew Mr. Oliver Hill was the famous civil rights attorney in Richmond. We were good friends, and I went down there and I said, Mr. Hill, I'm moving to Leesburg. And his face lit up and he said, let's go to my club. We went to his club and had lunch. I have something to tell you. And so all this spun out because Houston took his two top law students. He took Thurgood Marshall and Oliver Hill out here to do research for him. And, it's so complicated. I won't even get into the context. I understand why you didn't get it, because it's very significant national case. It was time when the NAACP was in competition with the Communist Party, with the American Lawyers Guild, and the Scottsboro case was taking place in Alabama, and it was covered.
The labor movement. There's so much happening.
Bruning wrote these articles very critical of the NAACP and of Houston in the Nation magazine. When he later became the first U.S. Senator from Alaska, we're all in a rabbit hole. But it was. Houston said, this is a very poor case. My client is a sort of a weak client because when he was in Massachusetts, the governor of Massachusetts wouldn't extradite him to Virginia because they thought he would not get a fair trial. He'd be executed. I mean, Virginia in 1907 put an electric chair in Richmond, and they said, we don't need guys running around in sheets hanging people.
Yeah,
we'll take care of it.
Yeah.
And they did. Oh, they did.
That's very
And they started executing black men left and right. And so they figured, and so the governor of Massachusetts wouldn't extradite him. And so they didn't go to federal court. But Gallagher went up there to Massachusetts and interviewed Crawford. And Crawford sort of made a confession to him. I mean, they had that. Then there was this whole detail about Bertie DeNeal and his girlfriend placing him. And he had this connection to Ms. Vilsey, he'd been her chauffeur and all this stuff. So what Houston's goal was to impugn the way that Judge Alexander had selected the jury. But this was unbelievable. This was like taking a moonshot because there are only 56 black lawyers in Virginia out of 2,500 lawyers. And there were 40 circuit court judges, and they were gods in Virginia. They appointed everybody in county government. They were huge, powerful figures. And so he put Judge Alexander on the stand, and Marshall and Hill went out and interviewed because he said he couldn't find black men that had property or anything. They found 13 that had property, that were, tradesmen, blacksmiths, etc. That were the equals of the whites that served on that jury. And so the court didn't rule in his favor. But what Houston said, if he appealed it to federal court, he could win, right? But then his summation to the jury, which was nine farmers and two merchants and one banker, all white, and it was so powerful that one of the white jurors wept, literally wept. And so to get him assigned to, not to the electric chair, but to life in prison was a triumph. And he said, if we appeal this, we'll have another jury in Virginia, and you can't ever tell what they will do. So what he had done, and the significance of oh no, sure. I'm not run on forever.
I think there are people who would like to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But that was what he was. So it was. I think that's why you don't find and mentioned.
Yeah, no, there was a huge case.
Houston wasn't as written. Yeah.
So, yeah. So
actually, that does kind of tie into my question. But first of all, thank you for doing all this research and bringing our story to light. I think the more we know about ourselves in the past, the better we understand ourselves today. One account that I read about the Hannah Nokes story notes that although she was talked about in the primary sources, this was first draft, the newspaper accounts.
Yes.
Accurately as usual about coming out, but then she ends up being dropped out of secondary sources about the Crawford file. I guess. First question, is that true? Does she really kind of get erased? And then the way that this person wrote that up is that she was dropped out of the secondary record. This is an example of white supremacists erasing a black person from the historical record. And I guess I would pursue your take.
I don't disagree, but I also don't know that she was really a critical witness. As I said, I mean, I don't think the Commonwealth had to call her because they could have established her testimony. Really, I don't think was that critical. Robert Hughes, the kid on horseback, he testified. Her nephew testified, and so in looking at the case, I understand when people recap the Crawford case that she is not included. My problem comes when we look at something like the report, the study in 2019, looking at the significance of African American history at this courthouse, and that she is not mentioned there. Absolutely, she should have been mentioned there. So I often think people are erased because of their gender or their class or their race. But most of the major publications really didn't include her to begin with. My concern is that how many historians have looked at this and didn't think to, if you're a legal, your specialization is African American history or legal history or civil rights. Okay, maybe this, her story is not your focus. But I just feel like those, when we come across somebody whose story has not been preserved or shared, share it with another scholar who perhaps will look into it, because and many transgender historians specializing in transgender issues, have made that argument that it's we need to bring light to them because they have been forgotten and overlooked. So I don't disagree, but I also I do understand when it comes to the Crawford case, she was not it. Does that help? Okay. Yes.
Thank you for bringing this research and stories to us. I teach at Parkview High School in Sterling Park.
Yeah,
And I
right there.
think this would be great to bring students. And is this published in the book?
It is.
Does it include the images from your slideshow?
Just this one, just the one of her. But I'm happy to share what I have with you if you wanna, yeah.
Yeah, I would love.
I have books here if somebody wants one, but if you want to just, I brought my cards in case you want to email me, but I'm happy to make this available because it's her story.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are people in the community, who might, who do remember her. I mean, I know there are because I've talked to some of them, but it's especially in Loudoun County, because at the time that I was finishing this, it wasn't the final, because of COVID, it got the publication. It took a while for Queer Virginia to actually come out. It was a good 5-year process. And the other stories and, in it, I just love. It really, when you, I get nothing from the book, so it's not like I have a motive here except to share knowledge, but it covers all parts of the Commonwealth and, different stories and experiences from our LGBTQ plus past. But anyways, so at the time that I was, kind of signing off, was right at the time of it was 4 years ago when our election for governor was, things changed pretty quickly from that summer till the election. And there was so much focus on what was going on in Loudoun and Loudoun schools and parental rights, and that really had nothing to do with students who were transgender. But I understand because of one of the criminal cases, some of the, I think it was unfair and of how it was portrayed. But I was also, as I'm writing this, and I'm thinking, my gosh, how is it that in 1933, the Commonwealth is calling a Black transgender woman as a witness in the biggest murder case you can imagine? And yet here we are in Loudoun, and this is actually an issue. So, yeah, yes.
Will you do book signings?
I would be happy to. I did books. Oh, you brought that? Okay. Thanks. Yeah. It's an academic press, so it's not like it's ever going to be a bestseller or anything, but there are some great. Did you get to read some of it?
I did.
Yeah.
That's great.
It was cool. So, and this is where I have to give a huge thank you to the editors, because as Anna mentioned, Charles Ford and Jeff Littlejohn, were the editors putting this together. And Jeff was my advisor in grad school. And so even though he's in Texas, he was like, hey, we're working on this. So you got any stories that, anything you're working on that might fit? And I was like, well, here I've got this story that I'm working on. And he was like, yes, see what you can do with it. So I had already shared little, this was not, again, it's not my story, it's hers. And I wasn't going to wait for a book to come out. In Alexandria, the Office of Historic Alexandria, every week they publish a column in one of our local papers. And so for Pride Month, when one year, I can't remember which one, I shared this photo and Hannah's story. And I was grateful that I did, because other people had used it and it was cited, and it's been, it was available before the book came out. And I'm just, I'm happy to always share research. So, Yes,
Is anything else known? I'm curious, like, about her home. So it was nested in the Millen farm?
well, if you look at a census, how the censuses were taken, and the first McMillan family she's working for is not the same location as the one closer to the high school. I have not been able to point on a map and say exactly where her home was. And I don't think she stayed in the same structure the whole time. I think she was closer up to the where Dranesville and Route 7 come together. I think she was living up there and then ended up going closer south towards Herndon. And so some family members have indicated that the last home she lived in was on the opposite side of the street from I should have brought a photo of that. Does anyone know that this house that got demolished a couple years ago, it was called the Coomer School of Dance? Okay. So that was the old Willow Spring Dairy Farm. And it was, if there's the high school, there's like a church, and then there was this house, and it came right up to Dranesville Road, and it was vacant for several years, and the county, Fairfax County, was hoping somebody would decide to move it or save it or something, but it did not happen. The Nokes family members I've spoken to indicated that her home was across the street and maybe a little further south. But she did not live in that same home, I don't believe, the whole time. So, yeah, I do. I look at old aerial maps and aerial photography. So I'm still hoping somebody will be able to say, yeah, I still have questions I will not get answered. Anyone else? Oh, thank you all so much for